The morning sun streamed through the windows of Riverside Cafe, casting warm patches of light across the polished wooden floors. The place was buzzing with its usual weekday crowd: students with laptops, business people in meetings, and locals enjoying their morning coffee. The rich smell of freshly ground beans filled the air, mixing with the sweet scent of pastries from behind the counter. Officer Raymond Mercer pushed open the glass door, the little bell above it announcing his arrival. Though not in uniform, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone used to wearing one. His service weapon sat concealed under his brown leather jacket, a habit he never broke even on his days off. His eyes scanned the cafe with the automatic assessment of a man who'd spent 12 years on the force. The cafe was nearly full, but not uncomfortably so. Several tables remained open near the back and a couple by the window. But Mercer's gaze fixed on a corner table where a well-dressed black man sat working intently on his laptop, papers neatly arranged beside a steaming cup of coffee. A small, reserved sign sat at the edge of the table. Mercer's jaw tightened. That particular corner table, the one with the good view of both the entrance and the street, had become his unofficial spot over the past year. He'd never bothered with reservations. His mere presence had always been enough to claim it. "Excuse me," Mercer said, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby conversations pause. "You're in my seat." The man looked up from his work, momentarily confused. He was in his mid-40s, with short salt and pepper hair and glasses that framed thoughtful eyes. His navy blue suit was impeccably pressed, his tie perfectly knotted. "I'm sorry," he responded, glancing at the reservation card on his table. "That's where I always sit," Mercer continued louder now. "Every Tuesday and Thursday morning." The man's expression remained calm as he gestured to the small sign. "I understand, but I reserved this table for a meeting I'm preparing for. The staff confirmed my reservation when I arrived." A young barista behind the counter watched nervously, recognizing Mercer as a regular customer known for his particular demands and occasional rudeness toward staff. "Look," Mercer said, stepping closer, "there are plenty of other tables for your meeting. I've been sitting here for months." The cafe had grown quieter now, with nearby customers exchanging uncomfortable glances. An elderly couple at the next table gathered their belongings and moved to a table further away. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," the man replied evenly, "but I specifically requested this table because of the outlet access and privacy. My meeting starts in 20 minutes. Perhaps tomorrow you could make a reservation." Something dark flickered across Mercer's face, a flash of anger disproportionate to the situation. His hand unconsciously moved to rest near his concealed weapon, a gesture not lost on the seated man. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Mercer asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "No, sir, I don't," the man replied, maintaining eye contact. "And I don't believe you know who I am either." Mercer leaned in closer. "I don't need to know. But in this neighborhood, when certain people are asked to move, they move." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. A woman at a nearby table pulled out her phone and began recording discreetly, sensing the tension escalating. The seated man didn't flinch. He straightened the papers before him with deliberate slowness, buying time to consider his response. His eyes moved briefly to Mercer's jacket, where the outline of a service weapon was just barely visible. "Sir," he finally said, his voice firm but quiet, "I'd like to finish my coffee without any trouble. I have work to do before my meeting." Mercer's face flushed red. People were watching now, witnessing someone refuse to bend to his will. His hand moved closer to his weapon, fingers twitching slightly. What had begun as a petty disagreement over a coffee shop seat was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and neither man seemed willing to back down. The tension in Riverside Cafe thickened like storm clouds gathering. Other customers pretended to focus on their phones and laptops, but their attention was fixed on the increasingly hostile exchange in the corner. The barista behind the counter had stopped wiping the espresso machine, her hand frozen mid-motion. "I don't think you understand what's happening here," Mercer said, his voice dropping lower but gaining a dangerous edge. He leaned forward, placing both palms flat on the table. "Some people need to learn respect." The seated man took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee before responding. His calm demeanor seemed to further irritate Mercer, whose neck was now flushed red with anger. "Respect is earned," The man replied quietly, not demanded. Mercer's nostrils flared. He glanced around, noticing the eyes darting away whenever he looked in their direction. Then, under his breath, but just loud enough for the seated man to hear, he muttered words laced with racial venom, ugly, ancient slurs that revealed the true nature of his anger. The seated man's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes, a momentary pause in his breathing. Then, with remarkable composure, he closed his laptop. "I think you should walk away now," he said, his voice steady despite the insult. "This doesn't need to escalate further." A middle-aged woman at the next table stood up, coffee in hand, and deliberately moved to sit at a table closer to the door. Her eyes met the seated man's briefly, a silent communication of support and concern. "Or what?" Mercer challenged, his right hand now drifting toward his jacket. "You'll make me." The cafe had fallen completely silent. Even the ambient music seemed to have stopped, though it was actually still playing softly from overhead speakers. A college student near the window was recording the confrontation on his phone, trying to be discreet, but obviously documenting what was unfolding. "I'm asking you professionally to step back," the seated man said, his gaze now fixed on Mercer's wandering hand. Something in his tone, a note of authority perhaps, pushed Mercer over the edge. In one fluid motion born from years of police training, he pulled back his jacket just enough to reveal the handle of his service weapon. He didn't draw it fully, but his fingers wrapped around the grip, a threat made unmistakably clear. "Professional?" Mercer sneered. "Let me show you professional." Time seemed to slow down. A woman with a young child hurriedly gathered their things and moved toward the exit. The barista reached for the phone behind the counter. Two businessmen stood up, uncertain whether to intervene or flee. The seated man didn't flinch. Instead, he placed both hands where Mercer could see them on the table, palms down. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, his voice now carrying a weight and authority that hadn't been there before. "I strongly advise you to remove your hand from your weapon." Mercer's sneer deepened. "Or what? You'll call the cops?" He laughed sharply. "I am the cops." "That's what concerns me," the seated man replied, his eyes never leaving Mercer's. From a nearby table, someone whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Someone call 911." Mercer's hand tightened on his weapon. "Stand up," he ordered. "Stand up right now." The seated man took a deep breath and slowly pushed his chair back. As he rose to his full height, slightly taller than Mercer had anticipated, his jacket fell open slightly. "I said you were making a mistake," he said calmly, reaching carefully into his inner pocket. "And now I'm going to prove it." Mercer's eyes widened, his hand starting to pull the gun free from its holster. But he froze when instead of a weapon, the man produced a wallet that he flipped open with practiced precision. Inside was a gleaming badge, not just any police badge, but one that made Mercer's face drain of color instantly. "I'm the new Director of Internal Affairs," the man stated, his voice now carrying throughout the silent cafe. "And you, officer, have just made the biggest mistake of your career." The badge gleamed under the cafe lights, its polished surface catching the morning sun streaming through the windows. The shield-shaped emblem seemed to radiate authority beyond its metal confines. Officer Mercer's mouth opened slightly, then closed again without words. The Internal Affairs Director kept his badge displayed, his steady gaze never leaving Mercer's face. "Officer Raymond Mercer, badge number 4721, Metro Police Department, Northeast Precinct." Did I get that right? Around them, the cafe remained frozen in silence. A young barista's hand hovered over the emergency button under the counter. An elderly man near the window looked ready to intervene despite his age. The college student's phone was still recording, its small red light blinking steadily. Mercer's hand slowly released his weapon, though his expression hardened into something between defiance and fear. "How do you know my name?" "It's my job to know every officer in this department," the director replied calmly. "I've been reviewing personnel files since I started 3 weeks ago." He slipped his badge back into his pocket, but kept his movements deliberate and slow. "Though I admit, I didn't expect to meet you like this." A quiet murmur spread through the cafe as customers realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The barista finally pressed the emergency button, her eyes wide. You were going to draw your weapon on an unarmed civilian, the director continued, his voice level but firm. Over a table in a coffee shop. Mercer's jaw tightened. You don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly. The director gestured to the small crowd around them, and so do approximately 15 witnesses and at least 3 phone cameras. For the first time, Mercer seemed to fully register the audience they had attracted. His eyes darted around nervously before settling back on the director with newfound hostility. This is a misunderstanding, Mercer said, his voice dropping. I was just threatening a civilian with deadly force, the director finished for him, after using language that violated at least 6 department policies. An older woman at a nearby table nodded firmly. I heard what he said, she announced, her voice shaking slightly with anger. Every disgusting word of it. The director acknowledged her with a small nod, but kept his focus on Mercer. I'd like your weapon, officer. Mercer's hand drifted protectively toward his concealed gun. You can't do that. You need. I have the authority to suspend any officer I believe presents an immediate threat to public safety, the director cut in. Right now, that's you. Outside, the wail of approaching sirens became audible. Someone had called 911 after all. This is ridiculous, Mercer sputtered, his voice rising. You can't. Your weapon, the director repeated, extending his hand. Now. Their standoff seemed to stretch for an eternity, though it lasted only seconds. Then, with trembling fingers betraying his outward defiance, Mercer slowly removed his gun and placed it on the table. The director promptly secured the weapon, checking the safety with practiced hands before tucking it into his own jacket. Thank you for your cooperation, he said, his tone professional but cold. The cafe door burst open as 2 uniformed officers rushed in, hands near their weapons. They paused, taking in the strange tableau before them, a man in plain clothes holding a police weapon, facing another plainclothes man whose face was flushed with anger. Director, one of the officers said, recognition dawning as he spotted the man's face. We got a call about an officer threatening a civilian with deadly force, the director finished, gesturing toward Mercer. Officer Mercer and I were just discussing the serious implications of such actions. The responding officers exchanged glances, confusion evident on their faces. Officers Jackson and Tran, the director continued, addressing them by name, which seemed to surprise them both. I'll need you to escort Officer Mercer back to headquarters. He'll be turning in his badge pending a full investigation. Officer Jackson straightened instinctively. Yes, sir. Mercer's face had gone from red to ashen. You can't do this. The union will. The union will receive a full report, including witness statements and video evidence, the director said. He turned to address the cafe patrons. I apologize for this disturbance. The department takes these incidents extremely seriously. A young woman who had been recording spoke up. Do you want us to send you our videos? The director nodded, pulling out a business card. The department would appreciate your cooperation. My email is on this card. As the uniformed officers moved to escort Mercer out, the director added quietly, for Mercer's ears alone, 12 years on the force ends today. Not because you picked the wrong seat, but because you finally picked the wrong person to intimidate. Blue and red lights flashed across the front windows of Riverside Cafe as a third police car pulled up to join the others. Inside, the morning had transformed from routine to extraordinary. The regular customers who had come for their daily coffee now found themselves writing witness statements on the backs of napkins and received paper. The Director of Internal Affairs moved through the cafe with calm efficiency, speaking briefly with each witness. He thanked them for their time, collected contact information, and assured them their statements mattered. A young woman showed him the video she had captured on her phone. This is very helpful, he told her, watching the footage with a grim expression. Would you be willing to email this to the department? Outside on the sidewalk, Officer Mercer stood between the 2 patrol officers, his posture rigid with anger and humiliation. Passers-by slowed to stare, some pulling out phones to capture images of whatever was happening. One of the uniformed officers placed a hand on Mercer's shoulder, guiding him toward a patrol car. This isn't over, Mercer muttered, just loud enough for the officers to hear. Officer Tran, the younger of the 2, kept his voice professional but firm. Sir, I recommend you don't say anything more until we reach the station. Back inside, the cafe manager approached the director with a small USB drive in hand. "Our security footage," she explained. "All 4 cameras. The one in the corner has the best angle of what happened." The director accepted the drive with a nod of appreciation. "Thank you, this will be important." An elderly couple who had witnessed everything refused to leave until they had shared their account. The husband, a retired high school principal, spoke with quiet intensity. "Been coming here 5 years," he said, his weathered hands wrapped around a now cold cup of coffee. "Seen that officer before, always throwing his weight around, expecting special treatment." His wife nodded in agreement. "Last month he yelled at that young barista for getting his order wrong. The poor girl was in tears." The director wrote these details in a small notebook. "Previous behavior is relevant," he told them. "Thank you for mentioning it." By now, word had spread beyond the cafe walls. A small crowd had gathered outside, and a local news van had just pulled up. A reporter with a microphone was already approaching the patrol car where Mercer sat in the back seat, his face partially hidden from view. The director's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He checked the screen and answered immediately. "Yes, Chief, I'm still at the scene." He listened for a moment, his expression serious. "Yes, sir. Multiple witnesses and video evidence. No room for interpretation." Another pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." As he ended the call, the cafe door opened and a plainclothes detective walked in, scanning the room until she spotted the director. She approached with quick, purposeful steps. "Sir, I've been assigned to lead the investigation," she said, showing her badge. "Chief wants this handled by the book." The director nodded. "Good. We'll need statements from everyone here, and I want all the video evidence secured immediately." He lowered his voice. "And detective, the media is already outside." She glanced toward the windows where a camera crew was setting up. "I'll handle them for now. You should head to headquarters. The chief is calling an emergency meeting of the command staff." The director gathered his belongings from the table that had started it all, the laptop, papers, and half-finished coffee now cold in its cup. As he prepared to leave, the young barista approached him hesitantly. "Sir," she said, her voice still slightly shaky, "I just wanted to say, thank you. That officer has been intimidating people here for months. Nobody knew what to do." The director paused, considering her words carefully. "Sometimes it takes witnessing something firsthand to understand how deep a problem goes," he replied. "But I promise you it ends today." Outside, as he made his way through the growing crowd toward his car, the director's phone began to buzz continuously with notifications. The first video clips were already spreading across social media, being shared thousands of times each minute. What had begun as a dispute over a coffee shop seat was now racing across screens throughout the city. In the back of the patrol car, Mercer stared straight ahead, his future collapsing around him with each new share, like, and comment. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, carrying him toward a reckoning 12 years in the making. The glass-walled conference room on the top floor of police headquarters hummed with tense energy. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air as 8 of the department's highest-ranking officials sat around a long wooden table. Screens on the wall displayed frozen images from the coffee shop videos, Mercer's face clearly visible in each frame. The police chief, a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and 30 years on the force, stood at the head of the table. His normally composed face showed lines of stress as he paced slowly. 4 videos so far, he said, tapping a remote to cycle through the footage. 2 from inside the cafe, 1 from outside showing the arrest, and security footage that captures everything. The audio is crystal clear on 2 of them. The Director of Internal Affairs sat quietly, his notepad open before him. In the hours since the coffee shop incident, he had changed into a fresh suit, but fatigue showed in the shadows beneath his eyes. "Social media?" asked the deputy chief, a woman whose decades of experience showed in the no-nonsense way she studied the images. The public information officer, youngest among them, checked his tablet. "Over 200,000 views already. It's being picked up by national outlets now." The chief stopped pacing. "Let's be absolutely clear about what we're seeing. Our officer, in plain clothes but carrying his service weapon, threatened a civilian with deadly force over a table at a coffee shop. When that civilian turned out to be our new Director of Internal Affairs, the officer still did not back down. He looked around the room. Am I missing anything? The department attorney cleared her throat. The racial component cannot be ignored. We have multiple witnesses confirming Officer Mercer used racial slurs before escalating to threats. Heavy silence fell over the room. They all understood the implications. Where is Officer Mercer now? Asked the training division captain. In interview room 3, replied the deputy chief. He's requested union representation, which is his right, but he's not under arrest. His weapon and badge have been secured. The chief turned to the director. Your recommendation? Every eye in the room turned to the man who, just hours earlier, had been on the receiving end of Mercer's threats. The director closed his notebook and addressed his colleagues. I've reviewed Officer Mercer's personnel file thoroughly, he said, his voice measured. 12 years of service, 17 civilian complaints, 5 for excessive force, 4 specifically mentioning racial bias. All were investigated, but none led to serious discipline. He slid a folder across the table. His performance reviews show a pattern. Multiple supervisors noted his aggressive approach, but praised his proactive policing. His last 3 supervisors gave him above-average ratings despite documented concerns. The training captain winced visibly. The chief picked up the folder but didn't open it. Your recommendation? He repeated. The director met his gaze directly. Immediate termination. Not administrative leave, not desk duty. This department needs to send a clear message that this behavior has no place in our ranks. Murmurs broke out around the table. Typically, officers under investigation remained on payroll for months during reviews. Immediate termination was almost unheard of. The union representative, who had been silent until now, spoke up. The contract allows for immediate termination in cases where an officer poses a clear danger to the public, the department attorney interrupted. This qualifies. The chief held up a hand for silence, then turned to the wall of screens. He studied Mercer's face, the anger, the contempt clearly visible even in the frozen image. I've spent my career trying to build trust between this department and the community, he said finally. Every good officer on the force loses when someone like this walks around with a badge. He turned back to face the room. Prepare the paperwork. Officer Raymond Mercer's employment with this department ends today. I'll make the announcement myself at a press conference in 1 hour. The public information officer's tablet buzzed continuously with notifications. Sir, media requests are pouring in. They want a statement now. Then let's give them one, the chief replied. A clear statement that shows exactly where this department stands. As the meeting adjourned and officials filed out of the room, the director remained seated. He stared at the image on the screen, Mercer's hand on his weapon, face twisted with rage. It was the face of a problem much deeper than one officer, a problem that had been allowed to grow unchecked for years. His phone buzzed with a text message. The cafe manager. Thank you for standing up to him today. Many of us were afraid to. The director pocketed his phone and gathered his notes. The real work was just beginning. The press room at police headquarters hadn't been this packed in years. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, cameras and microphones pointed toward the empty podium. The air felt thick with anticipation, the buzz of whispered conversations filling the room like the hum of angry bees. On the mounted television in the corner, a news anchor's voice cut through the chatter. We're going live to police headquarters where the chief is expected to address this morning's incident involving Officer Raymond Mercer, who allegedly drew his weapon during an off-duty confrontation with the department's new Director of Internal Affairs. The video, which has now been viewed over 1 million times. The side door opened, and the room fell silent as the police chief entered, followed by the public information officer and the Director of Internal Affairs. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as they took their positions at the podium. The chief adjusted the microphone, his face grave. Good afternoon. Earlier today, an incident occurred at Riverside Cafe involving an off-duty officer from this department. After reviewing video evidence and witness statements, I have made the decision to terminate Officer Raymond Mercer's employment, effective immediately. A wave of surprised murmurs swept through the room. Reporters began shouting questions, but the chief raised his hand for silence. This decision was not made lightly, but the evidence is clear and overwhelming. Officer Mercer threatened a civilian with deadly force over a personal dispute. When that civilian was revealed to be our Director of Internal Affairs, Officer Mercer continued his threatening behavior. This conduct is inexcusable and does not represent the values of our department. A reporter in the front row stood up. "Chief, termination without an investigation is highly unusual. What about due process?" "The investigation is ongoing," the chief replied firmly. But the immediate threat to public safety required immediate action. The videos speak for themselves. Another reporter called out, "What about the racial slurs witnesses reported hearing?" The chief's expression hardened. "Those allegations are part of our investigation and will be addressed thoroughly. What I can say now is that discriminatory behavior has no place in this department." As questions continued to fly, across town in a dimly lit bar, a group of off-duty officers watched the press conference on a wall-mounted TV. Their expressions ranged from shock to anger to quiet resignation. "They threw him under the bus," muttered one, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force. "Didn't even wait for the union to step in." "Did you see the videos?" asked another, younger officer. "You can't defend that." "It's not about defending it," the first officer shot back. "It's about process. Today it's Mercer, tomorrow it could be any of us." A third officer, who had been quietly nursing her drink, finally spoke up. 12 years, 17 complaints, 5 for excessive force, 4 specifically mentioning racial bias. She looked around the table. "That's not a mistake. That's a pattern we all ignored." Silence fell over their table. Back at headquarters, the news conference continued. The chief stepped aside, allowing the Director of Internal Affairs to approach the microphone. "In light of today's events," the director began, his voice steady, "I am announcing a comprehensive review of our department's disciplinary procedures and training protocols. We will be examining how previous complaints against Officer Mercer were handled, who reviewed them, and why they did not lead to corrective action." Outside police headquarters, a crowd had gathered. Community members held handmade signs demanding accountability. Civil rights organizations had representatives speaking to news cameras. A gray-haired woman who identified herself as a retired teacher spoke passionately to a circle of reporters. "One firing isn't enough," she insisted. "The system that protected him for 12 years needs to change." By evening, the story had gone national. Cable news channels ran the coffee shop video on repeat. Social media exploded with hashtags and calls for wider police reform. Politicians issued statements promising investigations and oversight. In his home across town, former Officer Mercer sat in darkness, ignoring the constant ringing of his phone. The television played silently, his own face appearing on screen every few minutes in clips from the morning's confrontation. On the coffee table before him lay a half-finished letter to his union representative, demanding they fight for his reinstatement. But even as he wrote it, Mercer knew some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Some mistakes could never be undone. And some consequences, no matter how much he raged against them, were finally, irrevocably, catching up to him. 1 year later, the community center buzzed with activity. Rows of chairs faced a small stage where city officials and police department leadership sat side by side. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patches across the diverse crowd that had gathered for this milestone event. The Director of Internal Affairs stood at the podium, looking more comfortable in his role than he had a year before. Behind him hung a large screen displaying statistics and charts, all showing dramatic improvements in police conduct and community relations. 12 months ago, he began, his voice carrying throughout the packed room. A confrontation in a coffee shop exposed deep problems within our department. Today, I'm proud to share the results of our reform efforts. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a 40% decrease in use of force incidents and a 65% increase in sustained civilian complaints. These numbers tell an important story, he continued. When we created the Independent Review Board with real authority, when we revised our training to focus on de-escalation, when we implemented early warning systems to identify problematic behavior, we weren't just checking boxes. We were changing a culture. In the third row, the cafe manager who had witnessed the original confrontation nodded along with several other community members. Next to her sat the elderly couple who had provided key testimony about Mercer's pattern of behavior. They had become regular attendees at police reform meetings. The Civilian Oversight Committee has reviewed over 300 cases in the past year, the director explained, gesturing to a diverse group of citizens seated in the front row. Their work has been invaluable in rebuilding trust between the department and the community. The police chief stepped forward next, looking more weathered than a year before but standing tall. Change isn't easy, he admitted, adjusting the microphone. We lost some officers who couldn't adapt to our new standards, but we've also attracted a new generation of recruits who believe in serving with respect and accountability. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. Last month, when former Officer Mercer's lawsuit was dismissed by the courts, it sent a powerful message. The old ways of doing things are over. Across town, in a small apartment above a convenience store, former Officer Mercer watched the live stream of the event on his laptop. His face had grown thinner, lines deeper around his eyes. The dismissal of his wrongful termination lawsuit had been the final blow to his hopes of returning to law enforcement. Next to his computer lay a stack of rejection letters from private security firms. The viral video of his confrontation appeared in every background check, following him like a shadow he couldn't escape. Back at the community center, residents lined up at microphones placed throughout the room, waiting for the question and answer portion of the presentation. A young teacher approached the first microphone. "I've noticed more officers walking through our neighborhood, talking with residents," she said. "It feels different than before, less like they're looking for trouble and more like they're part of the community." The chief nodded. "Our new community policing initiative requires officers to spend 30% of their shifts outside their vehicles, engaging with the neighborhoods they serve." At the second microphone, an older man in a business suit spoke up. "My store has been in this community for 30 years. For the first time, I know the names of the officers who patrol my block. My grandchildren aren't afraid when they see a police car anymore." The director smiled. That's exactly what these reforms were meant to accomplish. When the formal presentation ended, people mingled around tables of refreshments. Officers in uniform chatted with community members, exchanging stories and ideas. A local news crew filmed the interactions, a stark contrast to the tense footage they'd captured a year earlier. The director stood slightly apart, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. The deputy chief approached, coffee cup in hand. "Quite a difference from your first day on the job," she observed. The director nodded. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes." That morning in the cafe was a turning point, not just for me or Mercer, but for this entire department. As evening fell and the event wound down, a young recruit approached the director somewhat nervously. "Sir," she said, "they teach about you, about what happened that day, in the academy now. They call it the coffee shop test." "The coffee shop test?" he asked, curious. "Yes, sir," she replied. "They ask us, would your actions in plain clothes stand up to scrutiny in uniform? Would you be proud to have your behavior caught on camera? Would you make the same choices if you knew who was watching?" The director smiled. "That's not a bad test for all of us to remember.